Well, today I want to speak to you about drought. We all know, living here in LA, what it's like to live with drought. Brown is the new green, they tell us. Save your water because it's all gone, they tell us. Scientists even tell us that this might be the new normal. The other day I was in my garden and, well, let me just tell you how great of a gardener I have. My sprinklers weren't working. And I looked down at the earth, the hedge line, and it is all dried up. Without water, the ground just dries up and it actually shrinks back from the edge. I don't know if you've ever seen this happen, but when there's no water, the ground literally becomes smaller and it cracks open. And these like fissures that run in between the earth's surface. When there's no water, teaches a tradition, there's no life. Can't survive without water. The soil of the earth becomes hard, becomes unforgiving, becomes a wasteland without water. Now, once you become thirsty, there's not much else you can think about. From the sacred readings of this holiday, from yesterday, we know this because Hagar and her son Ishmael, who were cast out of the camp, they were given 2 skins of water, enough for a couple days. But after walking into exile, tongue dried up, and there was no place for her to turn. She took her lad and put him under a bush and started to cry because she couldn't see this young boy die, a refugee in exile from his own home with no future, parched for lack of water. And we know from the text that in a great act of mercy, great act of compassion, the angel came out of heaven and got close to them. The angel got proximate to them and asked after their troubles, gave this suffering mother and son a luscious flowing drink. The angel helped them find the well, and they named that well Be'er Lachai Ro'i, which means the well that lets me see my life, flowing with sweet, unending water. The angel said to the mother and the son who felt dejected and disfavored and kicked out, lost, "You too are my people. You too shall be loved. You too shall have part in prosperity." It's right here, first day of Rosh Hashanah. We read it yesterday morning. Just think about that. Now in the Talmud, when droughts came, the community would gather together and they would pray. They would declare a public fast. There's an entire book in the Talmud called Ta'anit, dedicated to the very proposition that droughts are a communal concern that required both divine and human intervention. Crops were failing, the ground got hard and it cracked open, the cisterns laid empty, and the folk gathered together in places of study and places of worship, and they would take out that mighty shofar and sound the horn's blasts hundreds of times, filling the whole community with a sense of urgency. That middle blast we heard today called Tru'ah, you heard many times, it's that short one, that one. That blast comes from this book in the Talmud. It is a blast which means emergency. It means that we call out to God and to the world and say, this is an emergency. We must do something to save ourselves. Such is the great calamity of a drought. When there's no water to slake our thirst, when there's no angel overhead to give us drink, when water flow ceases to flow over the land, when there's no water to bring life back to that which is dead, they blew the shofar from the rooftops and cried, "This is an emergency." Now, lest you think that this morning's sermon is only about water, mind you, you don't know me very well. There's a greater drought that I feel compelled to address today. It's not the lack of rain, for the well springs of water that seem to have given up their gifts to us drew my attention to this topic today. We have a Department of Water and Power to look into that to help us through this drought. Although if you looked at my water bill, I'm not sure you know how well that's actually being handled. Now, what I'm going to talk about can't be handled by any governmental bureaucratic agency. No bureaucrats, even the most conscientious or efficient or most well-meaning, can do anything to quench the drought that I speak of today. It's a drought of a different kind. It's the kind of drought that this day, Rosh Hashanah, and in fact Yom Kippur, were built for. A drought that brings us together in the house of study and of worship. A drought that compels us to pull out the shofar and sound tru'ah. A drought that makes us want to shout from the rooftops and say that this is an emergency. Friends, when I look at the year that was and I see the world today, there is a strange drought in the world. Not of water, but a drought of mercy, a drought of compassion in the world. Just like the soil beneath our feet, compassion, mercy, love, when it's missing, we become hard. We shrink back from each other. We allow the fissures of our own bigotry, of bias, of sexism, hatred, racism, classism, xenophobia, open a yawning chasm between us. We shrink away from one another, looking to protect our own interests to the exclusion of others. We let these fissures between us grow. And just like the soil, our souls, when not watered with compassion, die a little every day. When we stop drinking from the flowing waters of love that moisten our tear ducts at the plight of the despondent, or moisten our backs with the sweat of hard work for pulling those who have not yet found prosperity out of poverty. Without that loving water of compassion, our hearts become hard like the soil, and we die a little. One only need to look back at the past couple of years, and you can see with me just how arid the world's ethics have become, how dry and brittle our sense of togetherness is, how our personal wellsprings of morality stopped flowing. In Syria, 500,000 people have died because of war. 60 million people are homeless, more than any other time in the history of the world. Just since last week, just since I first began putting my thoughts together, 96 children have been killed. 223 more have been injured in eastern Aleppo alone. And what choices do these kids have? If they stay, they end up like Omar Daknish, a small 5-year-old boy, much younger than my own son. And where my son wakes up at 3 a.m. to get a thirsty drink of water, Omar woke up on Wednesday night. And over the summer at 3 a.m., his whole world collapsing around him. The screaming of a jet is heard overhead, and a bomb pierced the roof of his apartment. And the floors crushed together under the explosion like a paper cup. His brother Ali was mortally injured. His parents lie dead in the ruins. I watched along with the world with the sheer intensity as he stared silently, sitting in that orange chair barefoot, wiping dried blood and thick soot from his face. What choice does he have? If they leave, there's a good chance they'll die on the journey to safety by violence, by starvation, or as the world knows, the fate of little Alan Kurdi, whose lifeless body rested by the sea on that fateful morning. Oh, how hard, how dried up our compassion has become for each other, and how parched the world is for love. But let us not pretend that this drought has dried our cisterns of compassion only in the Middle East. Let us dodge no issues today. Let us make no compromise with callousness. In this drought, racism, sexism, and bigotry, violence and xenophobia here in America are all consequences of the moral desiccation of our age. If you look at the California Endowment's website, you can type in your zip code, and they'll tell you how long you'll live. Taken hundreds of studies and statistics and aggregated them together into a computer, a little app. If you type in 91436, our zip code here at VBS, you're granted about 83 years of life. If you live in South LA, however, it's less than 75 years. It's 8 or 9 year difference depending on the statistics. But it's not a matter of luck. It's a matter of racial and economic discrimination. Poor white people and poor people of color pushed into the least desirable parts of our town, where there's too much traffic, not enough medical services, no access to capital, overcrowded and under-resourced schools. And before you close up your ears and say that there's no such thing as systemic racism, you got to know that you don't have to be a racist to be part of a system that has racialized outcomes. What do you call a system that disadvantages some and advantages others? And those who are left in the dust are overwhelmingly people of color. What do you call an educational system that places the best teachers and the most resources in schools that leave the overwhelming number of kids behind who are of color? What do you call an economic system where the rules leave a disproportionate number of people of color without access to good capital, without good investment, where businesses can't grow and homes can't be bought and good upperly mobile jobs can't be found? It's not the people who are racist per se, but the outcomes of our political, educational, and social systems have racial outcomes. What do you call systems like that? They're called racist. That's what systemic racism means. And then there's the harder edge of our systems, the more violent edge. We look at the world. And we have to say their names today. Men like Terrence Crutcher and Eric Garner, Sandra Bland and Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, numbers of other men and women of color who met the end of their life unnecessarily at the hands of police. Or on the other side, Senior Corporal Lauren Arendz, or Officer Michael Kroll, Sergeant Michael Smith, Officer Brent Thompson, or Officer Pax Zamparia, all of whom were peace officers that were murdered in the streets they were trying to protect this last summer in Dallas. Racism and its backlashes of violence, these deaths are victims of our lack of compassion for each other. Oh, how hard and how dried up our compassion has become, how parched our world is for love. And we know that religion can be as much a culprit against compassion as anything else. When in San Bernardino, Saeed Rizwan Farouk and Tafshin Malik just this past year murdered those innocents at the Inland Regional Center. Or in Orlando, when Omar Martin went to the Pulse nightclub, where he killed 49 people and wounded 53 others in the largest hate crime and terrorist attack since 9/11. Religion can be as bad as anything else. A source of love and compassion can be dried up. Oh, how hard and dried up our compassion has become. How much the world needs love. I feel moved by Rabbi Heschel's words when he was asked to speak at the first and only conference on religion and race in 1965. The Riverside Church, right by my old apartment in Harlem. He said, "How many disasters do we have to go through in order to realize that all of humanity has a stake in the liberty of one person? Whenever one person is offended, we are all hurt. And what begins as inequality for some inevitably ends as inequality for all." Oh, how we have forgotten this wisdom. How dried up our compassion is, and how much our world is parched for love. Now, I know that many in this room can be uncomfortable if we bring up racial tensions. It's easier for us to decry the hate of the jihadis or bigotry or the fight against the state of Israel than it is to look at our own home. I know that the dizzying nature of violence and injustice we see every day can give us moral laryngitis. It can exhaust our ability to act because we simply just don't know where to begin. As Martin Luther King once said, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty. I know that all of our lives are already busy with business and travel, with taking care of our families and our own social commitments, and I know that many of us come here today on this holy day of the new year to find sanctuary from tumult of the world, that a synagogue should be a respite from the outside world. And there are those who say the faithful should have no voice in the social political world. My life inside this building, they say, has nothing to do with what happens outside this building. This building is my sanctuary. But you got to know that there's no word in Hebrew for sanctuary. Sanctuary is derived from the Latin sanctarium, which means a container for keeping something in. We have no Hebrew word for that kind of spirituality. We have no notion of sanctuary. When God created the world, according to the Kabbalists, The world couldn't contain God's essence, couldn't keep it in. When Solomon dedicated that grand temple in Jerusalem, his first speech he gave on its dedication said, "But will God really dwell on earth? Is this temple I have built?" In fact, our first sanctuary wasn't a marble and limestone building in Jerusalem. Our holiest shrine for 2,000 years was a tent in the desert, open to the currents and heat of the world. Our meeting places today are called Batei Knesset, houses of meeting. The first home a wedding couple builds together, a chuppah, is open on all sides. And in a few days, when we build our Sukkot, a place that, according to the Talmud, represents God's glory and protection on earth, it is nothing more than a fragile shack, open to the whims of the world. We know nothing of sanctuary. We only know of holiness between people. That's why we understand our religion as through the idea of covenant, of brit, of promises we make each other. We only know of this holiness despite the fragility of the walls. A temple is a place of prophecy. It's a meeting place of poetry, as the poet laureate of the United States, Billy Collins, once said, a place where truth marries beauty. Our understanding of holiness is not to hide away from the world, but to go into the world. Our holy places must have windows, say the rabbis, not mirrors. You're not allowed to pray in a room with a mirror because we want to live in a world of windows, not in a world of mirrors. And as we look out these windows onto this world, it is parched. The poor cry out thirsty for our love. Those that feel disadvantaged because they are black or Latino or are gay or are women or they're immigrants or refugees, they're crying out like Hagar and Ishmael did yesterday morning when we read those words so eloquently from our own Torah. This world is dry, dry, dry. And shall we not look upon this spiritual drought with the same intensities as our ancestors did? Shall we not gather together in our places of study, in our places of worship, and blow the tru'ah, blow the shofar, and say that this is an emergency, that this is an emergency? The word compassion in Hebrew is mirachem. It comes from the word rechem, meaning womb, a source of life and love that every person who lives should understand. And we attach this name to God when we seek God's compassion. We call upon God Harachaman when we have eaten our fill and are satisfied, and we ask God to share the love we feel in that moment with other people. We call on God today, over and over again, El Rachum V'Chanun, a God of compassion and grace. We ask for God to move from a sterile, strict sense of judgment, of deen, to a chair of compassion, a throne of rachamim. The book of life is open today, and it is God's compassion we seek today. And when we stand over the graves of our loved fathers and mothers, our brothers and sisters, and God forbid, even our own children, we call upon God, El Malei Rachamim, Shochim B'Mromim, a God full of compassion who dwells on high, to give compassion to the dead and to the living. But the word merachem is not just a feeling. It is an active, transitive verb. You can't just sit there and have compassion in Hebrew. We don't have any notion of just having compassion. You don't have compassion, you do compassion. You don't have compassion for the mourner. You go to their home and make sure they can put things in order. You don't have compassion for the poor. You give charity, tzedakah. You help them find a job. You don't have compassion for those who live at the margins of society. You go to the margins of society. You become proximate to them. You live there with them and bring them into the center. To have compassion in Hebrew is to be active, to be transitive. It's not simply a feeling, it is a lived behavior. It's what waters our souls and softens our hearts. The idea of active compassion teaches us that each of us, every one of us, as the lawyer and advocate and writer Brian Stevenson once said, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. Compassion, rachamim, teaches that we are not our mistakes. we are so much more than our worst selves. And if that's true for us, then it's true for everyone. It's true for the refugee and for the poor and the dejected, and it's true for the ex-con, anyone who's ever made a mistake, anyone who doesn't look like us, think like us, or live like us. They deserve as much compassion actively as we ask for ourselves from God today. The book of life is open today, and it's not just our signature we seek in the life column. It is those that we love, and those that we know, and those that we don't know. Rabbi Schulweis once taught, God didn't create religion. God created the universe, and we, men and women, we created religion. He said on Rosh Hashanah, why other religions count their years by acts of religious advents or cataclysms that shaped their culture, we Jews chose for ourselves a more universal stance. If you're a Christian, you call this year 2017 Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord Jesus. If you're a Muslim, today, same day as our day, begins the year 1438, AH, or Al-Hajira, where the advent of Muhammad is marched to Mecca. And for us, Rosh Hashanah is 5777. Not since Sinai, not since Exodus, not since the birth of Moses, not from Abraham, but the creation of the very world. And that's because Judaism is an outward-facing religion, one that it's never solely for its own sake, but for the sake of the world. God's outstretched arms, mighty hands, inspire our outstretched arms and our mighty hands. God reached into the world, and so too must we reach into the world. Stevenson writes again, we are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. And he says, I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy. We all need justice, and perhaps we all need a measure of unmerited grace. This is the drought I'm speaking of, this dryness that pulls us away from each other, that hardens our hearts against each other. It's only through compassion, our active compassion, that we can water our souls, slake the thirst that is crying out from the land. Now, back in the Talmud, the leaders did convene the community when it didn't rain for many days. They had no idea what to do. Their prayers stopped working. The community was on the verge of collapse. And then one rabbi noticed that a divorced husband wasn't paying proper alimony to his ex-wife and children. They were on the streets, homeless. He arranged to make sure that that man paid the proper payments and to bring that family out of poverty. Another found orphans who weren't being treated very well, and he taught them the Torah and brought them into the community. And only then did a virtuous cycle of compassion spread through the village. People began doing beautiful, wonderful acts of kindness to each other. And only then did the clouds begin to darken, and the wind began to blow, and the rains came. For they finally leaned into their feeling of being uncomfortable with the world as it is. And they heard the sound of the shofar, and they heard the words of the ancient prophet Amos, who said, "Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream." In the coming weeks, I seek to convene conversations about this very question, about our relationship as Jews to people of color. I invite you to join me. I don't know what shape they're going to take yet, but I know it must happen. We need to be proximate. We need to be like God and choose to become close to that which we don't know. I've already reached out to many pastors in the community, as well as community organizations, to learn from them. I'm also looking into the refugee crisis in Syria. And so if you're interested in becoming proximate to these issues, come find me. Write me an email, send me a message, leave me a voicemail, because it's our proximity that will create our compassion, and it's our acts of compassion that will build this world with love. As Martin Buber, the philosopher, once said, all life is meeting. It begins with proximity, with story, with relationship. So join me in the conversation. I end by paraphrasing Abraham Joshua Heschel, who at the end of his speech on religion and race said, "There is no rock so hard that these mighty waters cannot pierce it." I would add, there's no heart so hard that the waters of compassion cannot soften. Justice is not only a value, but a challenge. And as Heschel said, it's a restless drive. And while now I know the ground is hard, and the surge is choked, and the sweep is blocked, the mighty stream of compassion can break all dikes. It will flow sweetly, and the world will again be reborn in love and compassion. I want to wish all of you a Shana Tova U'Mituka, a year ahead of sweetness and goodness and love and compassion. And together we say, Amen. Continue with the words of Ritzeh on page 320.